Welcome to Neon Galactic, a podcast produced by PBS affiliate Key TV in Eureka, California. I'm your host, James Falk. Before we get started, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to this channel. Productions like this are made possible through the support of viewers and listeners like you. The universe is a mysterious place, emerging through the unfolding dimensions of space and time as a daunting vastness, yet one shot through with connections and linkages that inspire us to wonder and experience. As we each trod through our earthbound lives, seemingly separated from the whole and cast like tiny particles of dust into the whirlwinds of entropy and transformation, we get hints that say otherwise. This show has covered many of those hints, from UFO and UAP sightings and near-death experiences to spiritual awakenings and psi phenomenon. All these things are telling us something about the nature of things and the nature of ourselves. But what and why? Our guest today, Sharon Hewitt Rawlette, is a philosopher and author who has plumbed these depths and written books about what she has found. In particular, today we are focusing on her book, The Source and Significance of Coincidences, a hard look at the astonishing evidence. The book focuses on synchronicities, or meaningful coincidences, but through that lens, she grapples with the wide spectrum of people's paranormal experiences and what those experiences say about the nature of everything. Please enjoy. How did you get into this subject of anomalous, phenomena, and what do you feel like your mission is in this study? You've written several great books. You placed in the Bigelow competition. What's your mission?
So I got into the study of anomalous phenomena, I guess you would call them, through personal experience, as I imagine many people do. It's hard to take a lot of this stuff seriously until you've experienced something for yourself that defies your normal way of explaining the world. So for me, it happened rather gradually through experiences of synchronicity and coincidence. I kind of use those terms interchangeably. So when I say coincidence, I don't mean something that is a mere coincidence or that's just chance. It could be something very meaningful. I use it as this umbrella term. But I started having these, little experiences that in the beginning weren't necessarily something that I would have written a book about, or I would have broadcast to the world and say, hey, here's proof that there's more to the world than we've understood. But they were things that were improbable enough and meaningful enough to me that they started my inner wheels turning and started me researching things. So let me give a little bit more background about myself. So I grew up an evangelical Christian. And then when I was in college, lost my faith because I felt like there wasn't any evidence that I could see for a higher power and certainly for the various doctrines that I was being taught. And oddly enough, during that period, there were several times when I was very earnestly praying to God, like, give me some kind of sign that you're there. Like, I want to believe in you, but I just need something to hold on to. And I got absolutely nothing. Like, it was just radio silence. And so I was like, okay, I guess, I can't believe it anymore. There doesn't seem to be any reason to. So it was very hard to leave that community, my faith community, and, what my family and friends all believed. But I felt like intellectually, to be intellectually honest, I had to. And so I spent about 10 years, I guess, really believing in the atheist, not necessarily physicalist understanding of the world, because I had a pretty healthy respect for the phenomenon of consciousness itself. Like, I thought consciousness is something non-physical, but I didn't necessarily think it was anomalous or anything. It wasn't, ESP or anything. It was just there's some sort of inner life to the world. And I was interested in understanding what that was. But after those 10 years, I started to have these semi-strong synchronicity experiences. And so I started doing some research, and actually, synchronistically, I came across a couple of books that really opened my mind to the amount of research that had been done on these topics. One of them was a book by the French parapsychologist Bertrand Meilleux. He wrote a great book called Les Miracles de l'Esprit, The Miracles of the Mind, and laid out a lot of very recent research in parapsychology that I had never heard of. So at the time that he wrote that, Daryl Bem's experiments on presentiment and precognition had just come out. And so I was fascinated that there were, bona fide psychologists studying this stuff. And I also synchronistically came across Ian Stevenson's book, 20 Cases Suggestive of Reincarnation. And reincarnation was just like completely beyond the pale for me. But because of the way that this book arrived in front of me, I was like, okay, well, maybe I should at least like read it and see what the guy has to say. And then I was just blown away by the amount of rigorous detail he provided in his research. So I started reading those books, realized there are serious people who think that there might be something to these phenomena outside of our current worldview. But I was mostly doing this research privately. I mean, it wasn't something that I talked about publicly. It certainly wasn't anything I had published on. And about 5 years into that research, I had another incredibly strong coincidence. In fact, the most improbably meaningful coincidence that I have ever experienced. That happened back in 2015. And when that occurred, that pushed me over the edge, and I realized not only is it important for me to research this stuff, but now I'm absolutely convinced that there is something else going on in the way that our reality functions, and that we need to talk about it. I need to talk about it. And I started doing even more rigorous research, particularly into probability theory. Since I had experienced all these coincidences, they're hard to quantify. And I wanted to understand whether there really were legitimate ways that we could do that. So I spent a lot of time in the mathematical aspects of the question, and ended up publishing a paper on that, and then publishing this enormous book on coincidences a few years later.
Yeah, can you go into what the coincidence was that
Yes.
shifted everything for you?
Sure. So my answer was already getting pretty long, so I was trying to shorten it. So yes, I can tell the story. So like I said, this happened back in fall of 2015. At that time, I was going through a really rough time. I had gone through a very difficult romantic breakup a few years prior to that. I'd been engaged to marry a Frenchman and was going to settle in France with him on his family farm. And that ended up not working out. I've since written a memoir about all the details of how that fell apart. If people are interested.
Saw that, yeah. I haven't read that one yet, but I plan on it.
But several years after that breakup, I wasn't in contact with my ex anymore, but there were still unsettled feelings about that, still wondering if he was okay. And I just increasingly found myself thinking about him, and also thinking about France itself, because that was a country that, independently of him, I was very attached to. And I had really had to mourn losing that country as well when I moved back to the United States. So in this particular fall of 2015, this was all very much on my mind. It was something I was thinking about constantly. And I went on a weekend trip with some friends up to the mountains of Pennsylvania. I'm from Virginia, so I was going up to Pennsylvania. And we were hanging out in a place that we didn't really know. And so one day we were driving around trying to find a grocery store, and we weren't having any luck. And so my friend who was driving asked her phone to find us the nearest grocery stores. And she gave it a voice command. And then because she was at the wheel, she handed me her phone so that I could look at the results and select the place that we were going to go to. So when she gave me the phone, it had a list of grocery stores there. We were near Johnstown, Pennsylvania. Had a list of grocery stores, and I tapped the button map because I wanted to see them visually. And the phone took a second or two to load. We were kind of out in the boonies. And when the map finally showed on the screen, it was not showing me the grocery stores that had been in the list. It was now showing me 4 or 5 little pinpoints that were marking grocery stores labeled Leclerc, which is a French grocery store chain. And each of these Leclercs had the name of a French town after it, or at least a French sounding town. I didn't necessarily recognize the particular towns, except for one, the city of Carhaix. And I couldn't remember exactly what part of France Carhaix was in, but I recognized that it was a French town. So when this happened, I was a little bit shocked. I hadn't been talking about this with this friend. I hadn't been talking about it with anybody that weekend so far. And, this was her phone. This wasn't my phone. So even if I had been, looking at stuff in France, that would have influenced her phone. I turned to her. I was like, your phone thinks that we're in France. I don't know what to do with that. I just handed the phone back to her because I was a little bit freaked out by this. She tapped another button on the screen. It went back to working completely normally. She said that she had never searched for anything in France on that phone. So we really had no idea what had happened there. And I can't recall any other instance in my life where I've used a GPS and it suddenly locates me in a different place. I mean, let alone a continent, an ocean away.
Yeah.
So when I got back home from that weekend, I was still thinking about this event. And, I had that little doubt in my mind that was like, well, maybe it wasn't really France. Like maybe it was like French Canada. Maybe there's like Carhaix in French Canada. So I Googled Carhaix, and indeed it was actually in France. And not only that, it was in the region of Brittany, which is the region that I had lived in with my ex. Now, it was not, really very close to the part of that region where I had lived with him. It was, I don't know, maybe 60 miles away, something like that. So it wasn't particularly close. But as soon as I saw that it was actually in Brittany, it was like I had this knowing or just very strong intuition that that coincidence was trying to tell me where my ex was on that day. But that this coincidence was even stronger than I had realized up to that point. Now, I was not in contact with him. I didn't want to be in contact with him. So I didn't really have a way of finding this out. So I was just sitting at my computer and I was like, well, I'm going to Google the date. I'm going to Google his name and see what pops up. Not really expecting anything.
Yeah.
But when the search results loaded, it showed a page from his blog, because he's a writer too. He had a blog. And on his blog, he had listed throughout that whole year of 2015, he had listed 4 or 5 events that he was going to be attending. One of them had happened on the day that this GPS event happened. And the event was in this town that he had called Kerglof. Didn't know what that was. I Googled that. Kerglof is 2 miles from the center of Carhaix. So if he was indeed at that place where his blog said he would be on that day, and he had used his phone to find the nearest grocery stores, he would have very likely seen the exact map that I was looking at in Johnstown, Pennsylvania on the same day.
That's startling and remarkable.
So that in itself was pretty remarkable, and it had a very strong emotional effect on me. It unsettled me. I was like, what is happening? Is this some kind of message? Am I supposed to do something about this?
Exactly. Yeah.
And in fact, I spent the next 4 or 5 weeks being inundated with other coincidences related to France and related to my ex. Nothing quite that strong, but the sheer quantity of them and the fact that they just kept coming, I couldn't get away from it. And eventually I got to the point where the emotional overload was too strong. And I decided that I had to write to my ex and find out what was going on. I couldn't think of any way of solving the situation that I was in. And
Yeah.
so I ended up writing him a very brief email, and I discovered that not only was he doing well, things seemed to be fine with him, but he had just had his first child. And his first child was born about 10 days after that GPS event.
Wow.
And my feeling after that happened was that that GPS event had happened in order for me to be in contact with him at that time that that transformational life event was happening. That was something that he needed to share with me. I needed him to share with me. We just
Yeah.
kind of needed to say, yeah, we're both doing fine. We're on our paths. It's all good.
Yeah.
And it was an amazing just feeling of relief and joy, really, and peace that came out of that. But it was all launched by that GPS event, and the it was a difficult, like month and a half where I was trying to figure out how to deal with it and resisting really what seemed to be the obvious implication, which is I should just ask him what was going on. But I kept resisting and resisting. But when I finally was able to allow myself to respond to that coincidence in this way, it produced a very positive result.
Would you say that it led you to healing? I mean, personally, or
Absolutely. Yeah.
yeah,
It
yeah.
was very healing.
Interesting. I excuse me. One of the things I really liked about your book is that nominally it's about coincidences, and it is, but what falls under the rubric of coincidence is every paranormal kind of happening, and a lot of times it's a placeholder for how we explain away things. Like, especially when you're talking about the term coincidence versus synchronicity, a lot of times when people say coincidence, it's like, oh, it's just a coincidence.
Right.
But yeah, but your book basically shows that it's a whole breadth of phenomenon. And anytime we have a hard time explaining how something's occurring, that's the label we put on it. But it's really about the nature of things and whether or not there's, intention, I guess, in the universe, and whether or not there's any kind of absolute value in the universe. So can you talk a little bit about that and
Yes.
where it's led your thinking?
So yes, the book, I mean, describes so many other sorts of anomalous phenomena because I think that you need to know about all of those things in order to understand what's happening in a coincidental event. Because for me, a coincidence is like the tip of the iceberg, right? So it's something that happens to you. It's not blatantly paranormal. Like there are normal ways of explaining these things, but it's improbably meaningful in a way that makes you wonder if there's something more to it. And if that was all we ever had, was those coincidences, then maybe we would just say, okay, yeah, statistically, we can explain them away. But when you see your synchronistic experiences against the backdrop of the most paranormal, inexplicable things that happen to people, I think it starts to not only convince you that there's something more to what's happening to you, but it helps you to see what the origin of those events might be. So a lot of what I try to do in my book is to explore what the different possible sources are for these events. Are they coming from God? Are they divine signs? Are they coming from angels or spirit guides? Are they coming from our deceased loved ones who are on the other side? Are they manifestations of our own ability to perform psychokinesis or our own telepathic capacities? There are lots of different explanations for them. And in fact, I think that different coincidences can be explained in different ways, and that all of these are valid explanations for some of them. And sometimes the sources overlap as well, because they also seem to be a cooperative phenomenon. It's not necessarily a coincidence that I produced through my precognitive abilities, or it's something that somebody else or some higher power produced, but it's the interaction between my desires and needs and my abilities and the desire of those other entities or beings to help me in some way. I think that's the GPS event that I experienced. I puzzled a lot about, what made that happen?
Yeah,
And
how can that possibly happen?
yeah, and I think it was strongly fueled by the emotions that I was feeling at the time. I think it was also strongly fueled by the emotions that my ex was feeling, especially related to the birth of his child. And I think that there may have been some more divine hand in it as well. I do think, for other reasons, that there is a higher intelligence that's kind of orchestrating some of these things. And so it's probably a mix of all of those different things.
You say for other reasons. Can I ask what some of those might be, or is that a whole broader conversation?
No, so I think one of the primary reasons has to do with near-death experiences, and also people's pre-birth experiences. So in culture, we're pretty familiar with people who temporarily die and come back, and they say they talked to some divine being who gave them all this information about the world that they never had before, and they felt this unconditional love from them, etc. But there are also people, and some of them uh, are people that I know personally that I didn't meet through my profession, but just people who happen to live, in the county where I grew up, and that in talking to them, I discovered that they have these pre-birth memories, these memories of things that they experienced before they were here in this body. And some of them are very similar to things that near-death experiencers talk about, this interaction with other intelligences on the other side, and often have to do with the idea that your life, the life that's coming up, that you're about to have when you go into this body, has a particular purpose. There's an intention there in coming into this body, that you're going to achieve something in particular, that you're going to interact with certain people, that you're going to do certain things. And so whether that higher intelligence or that planning process is orchestrated by something that we would call God, or whether it's more like a higher group consciousness that we're sort of all a part of in some way. I don't know the best way to parse that right now, but I do think that there is an intelligence that is more expansive and more intelligent than the one that I have while I'm here in this body.
Yeah.
And that influences the things that happened to me while I'm in this life.
Yeah, and that's another thing, great thing that your book does is it goes through all the various options of things, whether it's higher self or guardian angels or all those sorts of things, and doesn't take anything off the table, which I value. There's no like, you're not married to any one explanation or ontology about all of this, and I think that helps for a really healthy exploration of the topics. One of the things that I've been doing as I've gotten into this is trying to find various models that have been presented by previous thinkers, like Gurdjieff or Gurdjieff, I don't never know how to pronounce his name, and P.D. Ouspensky. They have a system, right? The Seth material kind of presents another system. There's all these systems that talk about, well, this is what's going on. I have a hard time with people being definite about that kind of thing, but I do find it really inspiring to kind of explore these things and see how they resonate. Have you found a model that you think is closest to what you're kind of exploring, or is this, or have you not gone to that point yet because you're still gathering information? I mean, how do you think about that?
Uh, my first instinct is to say no, I haven't found anything that feels definitive in any way.
Yeah.
I really think it's so important that we do stay open about the ultimate ontological framework that we're going to accept, because I mean, I think this comes, it's a lesson I feel like I've learned from the various ontological shifts that I've gone through in my own life, is to realize, yeah, whatever, I may think is the nature of reality right now, in 10 years and 20 years, that's probably going to shift pretty profoundly. And also the fact that what has shifted my views is looking at people's actual experiences, my own experiences, but also just, the experiences of thousands of other people. And as I continue to research and to talk to more people, I'm continually surprised at just how weird people's experiences can get.
Yeah.
Every time if I think, okay, well, maybe this is how we can explain what's going on. Like this seems like a pretty solid explanation. Then I hear about something happening to somebody that it doesn't fit that. It doesn't seem to fit any structure that I can come up with. And I want to stay open to all of that. I think we already have plenty of people in the world who have their preferred way of seeing the world and just fit everything
Absolutely.
into that. And
Yeah.
I really think we need more people who are just like, tell me about your experiences. Tell me what happened to you. Because we obviously don't know everything about the world that we're living in. And I want to know more. So, and I want to explore it empirically through what people actually experience, not coming at it with this idea that, well, this must be the first and last idea as to the nature of our world.
Yeah. I was also like you, where when I first got into these topics, I expected there to be a quality of scholarship, where, like, there's going to be some new agey types, and there was going to be maybe an occasional frontier thinker, but saddled with their own mystic prejudices or whatever. But I have been absolutely floored by the quality of the intellectual community that's formed up around this stuff. And some of the best minds that I've ever met or had a discussion with are on these same topics. And a lot of them hold that same principle, where don't take things off the table, just kind of live in the mystery and just collect the stories and the evidence to try and see what they may ultimately hint at, but without making any serious answers. But so I guess my question to you is, as someone who is a respected academic and has done a lot of work in this field, what how do you view the quality of the scholarship that's behind a lot of this research, and what do people who are sitting outside of it and judging it without getting involved, what do they need to know about this type of research and the quality of the thinking that's supports it?
Yeah. So, like research in mainstream academia and mainstream science, there is a range of quality,
Sure.
and there's a lot of people doing
A lot of
not
things.
great science out there out there in the world, and so there are people in the field of anomalous studies and parapsychology who are doing not great science too.
Yeah.
But there are also a lot of people who are doing excellent science. And I think that the marginal nature of the field does contribute to motivating people to do even better science than they would if they were working outside of this field.
Absolutely. Yeah.
You know that as soon as they publish something, like, they're going to be inundated with criticisms. And people in the parapsychology community, by the way, we're not all just like, oh yeah, that was great what you did. Like, we tend to criticize each other a fair amount as well,
Yeah.
which is very important to
Hmm.
furthering the field too.
Yeah.
But I think the fact that people in this world know the amount of mainstream criticism that's going to be directed at them really contributes to to them working as hard as they possibly can to make sure that their methodology is as airtight as it can be, to consider as many hypotheses as they can, to do their research. So I've been, well, like I said, with Ian Stevenson and Daryl Bem, from the beginning, I've been very impressed with the way that parapsychologists approach these topics, but I continue to be impressed by them as well. But the only way you can really tell who is to immerse yourself in the field and to look at the details of the way that people's experiments are put together, the way that they're going about collecting data.
It seems like if this were any other subject, it would be proved to the satisfaction of the academy, but that's not what this is. They don't want to accept it, so they put it off. They find reasons for. I mean, for instance, with the psychology debate, psychology science debate recently, there were some studies that came out that seemed to prove, whether, I mean, I guess psi on some level or another. And the whole institution of psychology basically breaks down and starts to say, well, there's a problem with how we're doing all of our studies because this can't be true. And they come at it from an approach of this can't be true, so there's a flaw in how we do everything. And that's a very interesting, I mean, it speaks to the strength of the scientific paradigm, right? I mean, like, people are basically discouraged to the point of ridicule to not pursue these types of topics. Which leads me to another question. I mean, as a someone who is in academia and has been through the those processes and dealt with those people, is there any shift at all really occurring? Part of what people tell themselves on these forums, like my show and other places, is we're making progress. This is, the physicalist paradigm is weakening. Quantum physics is proving this and that, and so all these things are kind of starting to be questioned. Is that really true? I guess. Do you think
It's
so?
a hard question to answer.
Yeah.
Because usually when we're making judgments about this, we're kind of basing it on our personal experience, what we're hearing people talk about, what we're seeing. And I mean, it's hard for me to say in an objective way, because of course, for me, I've moved from interacting mostly with people in mainstream philosophy and science to interacting primarily with people in the parapsychology community. So for me, it feels like, wow, like there's so many people that that endorse this alternative paradigm. That being said, I do think that there is some movement in the academic culture as a whole. And I do think that some of it comes from the continued trickle-down influence of quantum mechanics, because, I mean, over 100 years ago, quantum mechanics revolutionized the way that we understand what the physical world is, and put paradox at the very heart of reality. And it's something that we've been struggling to understand ever since.
And we haven't really come to terms with it. I mean,
no, I mean, we kind of insulated ourselves from it by saying, okay, well, that just only happens at the micro level. Like, once you get up to the level of visible objects, then everything's fine. Like, there's nothing quantum going on in human bodies, and now in the last few decades, we realized, well, no, there's actually quantum phenomena happening in biological beings. It's part of photosynthesis. It's part of all of this stuff that's going on. And so we can't really isolate it. And I think that, I don't necessarily think that quantum phenomena are directly related to psi phenomena. They may have some similarities, but I don't think we can really use quantum mechanics to explain what's going on.
Sure.
I mean, maybe I'm open to that, but I haven't seen a convincing reason to think that. So, but I do think that the fact that quantum mechanics is so well attested empirically, so well accepted, and it is so paradoxical, has done something to kind of open up people's minds and say, okay, yeah, reality really could be very different than we think, and we're starting to imagine other ways that the world could be. And another thing that I've seen happen within the philosophy community, because that's where my training is a shift to taking more seriously the nature of consciousness. So when I was in graduate school in the 2000s, I was very interested at the time in the philosophy of panpsychism, this idea that everything has an inner conscious experience. But that was very marginal within the community at that time. And it was something that ultimately I decided not to pursue. And it was something I remember when I was applying for jobs fresh out of grad school. I did lots of different interviews, and I finally did an interview where I happened to mention panpsychism offhand because it wasn't part of my dissertation or my research at the time, but I kind of mentioned my interest in it. So it was like, "Oh, we're very interested in that." I was like, "This is the place where I need to work. Somebody, these people are interested in this topic." So it was very marginal.
Yeah.
But now, 15 years later, I've been really pleasantly surprised to see the way that panpsychism has become almost mainstream within philosophy. And it's something that, and now I can say the word panpsychism on your podcast, and probably a lot of your listeners will understand what I'm talking about.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. For
Yeah.
sure.
And that wouldn't have been the case 20 years ago.
Yeah.
So it's the fact that at least the philosophy community, and I'm starting to move out into the sciences as well, but the fact that they are realizing that there's something to the nature of reality that isn't visible from the outside. It isn't visible, when we're poking and prodding things with our scientific instruments. But when you are the thing in question, when you're the being that's having the experience, it's something that it's a kind of knowledge that you're gaining that you can't get from the more objective external perspective. And so that, I feel like, is another door that's opening. So, quantum mechanics opened this the nature of consciousness has kind of cracked that door. And I think the real challenge for the next few decades is going to be, okay, we recognize that there are these cracks in the physicalist paradigm. So what do we put in its place?
Yes, exactly.
What's the new way of thinking about this that is going to help us make progress? It's really going to make sense of the world. And one of the things that I'm working on right now is trying to use the data from psi phenomena to illuminate the mind-body problem that has been plaguing philosophy for so many centuries, really since we started having the modern scientific paradigm. And to say, okay, maybe psi, the way that psi operates in this holistic, intention-based way, maybe that explains, or can help explain at least, how consciousness interacts with our physical body.
Yeah.
So
Interesting.
that's like what I'm working on right now, and
Yeah.
really excited about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I saw some notes when I was doing some research talking about how you are looking for an alternative to physicalism. And part of that includes the causal efficacy of intrinsic value, which I'm hoping you can explain that because that sounds absolutely fascinating. I mean, people, their hackles rise when we hear about like value being an intrinsic part of the universe, because then I guess the feeling is that we lose some moral or ethical freedom that way, or we become less self-determining if there's, absolute value in the universe. But then for a lot of folks, myself included, there seems like intuitively that can only be the truth, that can be the only truth, or however you want to phrase that. But can you help explain what you mean by that, and what that could mean for us as beings?
Yeah. So I do think a lot of people balk at this idea of value being an intrinsic part of the universe. They might be willing to accept that consciousness is, but like the idea that, value, like that's a whole other level of
Yeah.
crazy. But I actually think that once you have accepted that consciousness is a building block of the universe, or maybe the building block of the universe, then it becomes much more understandable how value could be part of the universe, because value is something that actually only makes sense from the perspective of a conscious being. So in my very first book, which was an academic philosophy book called The Feeling of Value, I try to explain that idea, that part of why we think the world couldn't be intrinsically valuable is because we're thinking of it as a physical world. And we say, well, no matter what object you might have out there, like it's going to be good, in some ways, it's going to be bad in some ways. It all depends on how you look at it or what you do with it, or it's very relative.
Exactly.
But if you think about your conscious experiences, and particularly if you think about the experiences of pleasure or pain or other positive and negative emotions like joy or love or peace or anxiety or depression or sadness, those experiences it seems much more possible that there's something intrinsically valuable about them. Because if you took an experience of pleasure, like just saying like, eating something that you really enjoy eating some chocolate, okay, and we're going to abstract from the food itself that caused the experience. We're just going to think about the experience of eating it and the pleasure that you're getting from eating this food. If we said, well, no, this experience is not intrinsically valuable, it could be bad. I think that there's something that doesn't make sense about that at a certain level. So it gets a little complicated. So there is one sense in which we could say, well, the pleasure that you're getting from eating that thing is bad because it might be instrumentally bad. So like say you just are eating this really sugary food and it's going to be really bad for your health. Okay, so like the pleasure might be bad in the sense that it's going to cause you to eat more of this stuff that's going to be bad for you, that's going to have bad consequences. So let's abstract from all of that as well. So we're just going to say, okay, let's not worry about the consequences. We're just talking about the intrinsic value, what is present in the moment of having the experience, not its effects or its origin. If that experience, if we try to describe what is intrinsic to that experience, what is the nature of that experience itself, I don't think that we can fully explain what it is to feel pleasure unless we say that it's good. It's something that has value, that is something that consciousness not only is attracted to, but we are attracted to it, but that we feel justifies our attraction. It's something that we ought to seek out purely because of the way that it feels to us. And pain is the opposite, right? It's something that, pain might be instrumentally valuable in various ways, but if you just focus on the experience of the pain itself, if that's all you had, you wouldn't want to create a world that had nothing but that experience in it. Like if the intrinsic nature of that experience is such that it's something that you would want to avoid unless you had some other reason, some instrumental reason for wanting it.
Yeah.
So when we examine the question of intrinsic value from the perspective of consciousness, I think it becomes a lot more compelling, this idea that it could be part of reality, because consciousness is part of reality.
Do you think do those value judgments or value assessments or whatever you want to call it relate to ethics in any way about how we should be living our lives?
I think that they do, absolutely. So I'm what you would call a utilitarian, or even a hedonistic utilitarian, which means somebody who thinks that ultimately what you ought to do in any particular situation is whatever is going to have the best consequences, in the sense of producing the most positive experience for everybody that's going to be affected by it. So not only do I think that that's what we ought to do on a day-to-day basis when we're making choices, and I mean, you have to use some sort of general guidelines. You can't obviously calculate this for all of your behavior. You sort of think, yeah, this sort of thing tends to produce more happiness in the long run, and this kind of thing doesn't. But I think those are guidelines for how we ought to make our personal day-to-day decisions. But I also suspect, and this is part of the theory that I'm developing, I suspect that the universe as a whole is trying to do that as well. That the reason that this universe is here is to produce positive experience in us, to give us the chance to experience all of the amazing things that we do experience. And I think it's a little bit complicated to explain why, but I think that the negative things that we experience actually are here because of the way that ultimately they contribute to positive experience, to making a more, to multiplying the positive experiences that we can have in this world.
Well, then it's the polarity too, right? Like, I mean, you often hear you can't have hot without cold, or you can't have pleasure without pain. I mean, if there's no contrast, if we lived in absolute pleasure all the time, we wouldn't recognize the value of the pleasure necessarily, which,
I'm not sure that I agree with that. I think actually, I think you can have pleasure by itself and it will be just as good as, but, and this is due to sort of like details about the way that I think about consciousness and the ultimate nature of reality. But I suspect, or I'm hypothesizing, that if all we had was an experience of pleasure, if pleasure was the only thing that existed, that the only way to increase the amount of pleasure would be to create an experience that is differentiable from the experience of pure pleasure. So you have to create other kinds of experiences that can be had along with the pleasure in order to make that an additional experience. Otherwise, it's just the same experience. You just have one experience of pleasure ever existing in the entire universe. And so to actually create an additional experience, and so to create more pleasure, you have to differentiate it in some way. Now, there are lots of ways that you could do that with other phenomenal qualities besides pain. So you might do it with colors and other sensations of various sorts. But ultimately, pain and other negative affect are one of the options that we have for multiplying pleasure. So say you used up all of the other non-pain-based phenomenology to multiply pleasure in the world. Well, if you introduce just a tiny bit of pain into each of those experiences that already exists, so you create like a copy of those experiences, but with a little bit of pain added, you've just doubled the amount of pleasure in the world, or almost doubled the amount of pleasure in the world, just by introducing a tiny bit of this not so great, or intrinsically not so great quality.
Yeah.
So
Interesting.
So, yeah.
Do you think, I mean, there is value though in pain, right? I mean, like in terms of like shaping character ultimately. I mean, I guess that's one of it's people talk about you don't want to change unless you have some sort of negative consequence for a thing, and then that makes you want to avoid the pain and seek the pleasure, which is the drive. But at the same time, I often wonder if there is a character drive to the universe, or a imperative toward growth. And if that, in order to experience that, and you see that with people talking about their previous lives or their between lives experience where they're planning their future existence, they talk about the predicaments they're going to set themselves up in, or the families they're going to choose, and they know that going into that from this, above meta soul position, that they're going to be facing hardship and they're going to be facing pain, and they go into that in order to grow in some particular way. Do you find any value in that kind of thinking, or what are your thoughts on that?
Yes, so absolutely. I think there are so many levels at which we can look at
Yeah.
the justification for the existence of pain and other types of negative experience. So I absolutely think that when we're sort of looking at our lives from this perspective of the life between lives and life planning, that yeah, it makes so much sense from the perspective of that soul that yeah, I'm willing to go through these hardships because of things that it's going to allow me to develop in my own character, or because of things that I'm going to be able to help other people with. I'm willing to accept that for those instrumental reasons. Absolutely. And
That's instrumental, like you were saying, right? So as
right.
opposed to, yeah, okay.
And so the explanation that I was giving before was extremely abstract, and it's something that I see happening at the most abstract level of reality. Because so say we're at the level of our souls in the life between lives, right? And we're planning our lives. So obviously we have some sort of overview perspective of at least, Earth reality. But the idea is that even at that soul level, there are deficiencies in ourselves that we're trying to fill, right? Things that we're trying to learn, or character traits we're trying to develop. And so then we get a question at that level, well, where did those character deficiencies come from? Why do souls come into existence with these problems that need to be fixed by going to Earth and learning these lessons? So kind of in each level, you can ask the question again, okay, well, where did that come? Like, why not just have a universe that's perfect from the get-go? Where did the need for these imperfections ever come in? And so ultimately what I'm trying to say is at the highest level of abstraction,
Yeah.
you need those imperfections in order to increase the amount of positive experience within the
Yeah.
world.
Fantastic. One of the reasons why I appreciate your work so much is I think that the idea of coincidence and synchronicity is a way to get people into this conversation, because a lot of people have moments where they're like, holy mackerel, that's not likely that that's a coincidence, but synchronicity is some, whatever. Confusion of labels there a little bit, but as a person who is in media myself, and I'm trying to host these podcasts and find people who have good things to say and can help guide people in their own thinking or explorations of these topics. What do you think are the most useful things to focus on for communicators and people in the media who want to help spread this conversation? How should we talk about it? And what do you think are the most fruitful ways to try and build the number of people that are involved in it?
It's a really good question. I, I think that for myself, when I'm consuming media, I think the most helpful and transformative things that I come across are people's first person testimonies about their experiences. I mean, I do think it's also important to have academics and scientists talking about their research, but I think the laboratory data, or even the more field data that they're collecting, that it's not enough to be convincing without the first person experiences of people. And I think that the fact that our media now are shifting, or I mean have been shifting for decades, towards more video and audio rather than the written word, is so helpful in making this transition, because a lot of things that you can read, in an article or read in a book, they're going to sound so fantastic, and you're like, oh, well, this person just, they don't know what they're talking about. They're crazy. They're making this up. They just want attention. But when you actually hear in an interview somebody describing what happened to them, and you hear the emotion in their voice, and you hear the sincerity of what they're telling you about, and also sometimes their embarrassment, because a lot of the weirdest things that happen to people are very embarrassing, and something that maybe they haven't wanted to tell people about for a very long time. They've been holding it inside. But when you hear somebody finally open up about this, I think that has immense transformative power, because you realize, no, that's just a normal person. Like, and obviously something happened to them that they can't explain. They seem intelligent, as intelligent as I am, and yet they think that this means something. Maybe there is something there that I need to investigate. So I really think amplifying the voices of experiencers of all types is an incredibly important job of the media.
I was after reading your book on coincidences, I was interested to see your library, because I imagined it being hugely vast with all of the experiences that you collected. And I mean, just from a personal perspective, how did writing that book impact you personally? I mean, did you find that it helped change your worldview, or I mean, it seems like it must have, but how did it impact how you ended up approaching your own life coming out of it?
Well, I think one of the biggest changes for me personally was having more confidence that the events in my life aren't random, and that there is some sort of orchestration to them. So that applies not only to the GPS event that I had in 2015, but also to its aftermath, because I feel like that event not only changed my own mind, but it catapulted me into doing this research and writing that has become my core contribution to hopefully not just academia, but to the culture as a whole, to the way that we think about our world. And I feel like I have, as I published that book and as various opportunities came along in the wake of that, I think I've started to realize that I can trust this process, that there are things that need to happen, and there are things that I in particular need to contribute to the conversation in our culture, but I don't have to stress about them, because I'm a type A personality. I tend to try to control everything and plan everything. And what I've realized is so much of what has happened has been coincidental. The opportunities arriving at just the right time to take the next step on this path. And so I've really started to relax into this idea that, yes, I have a mission, I have something that I'm supposed to do. But if I'm doing that, if I'm on the path and doing the work, that the next opportunity, or the next collaboration with somebody, the next person that I'm supposed to meet, those things are going to happen naturally. They're going to come at the right time. And I don't have to have it all planned out in advance. I can just do today's job, and then know that tomorrow and the next day, the next step is going to fall into place.
Last question. We're at an hour, or a little bit more even. But you'd mentioned that when you were a teenager, you were kind of calling out to God or the universe for a sign about whether or not he or it exists. Do you feel like that prayer may have ultimately gotten answered? Maybe not in the form or from the person or thing that you think should have been answering or would have been answering, but in some form or other, the universe responded?
I do think so, yes. And I've said before in other interviews that I think I needed not to have the answer at the original time that I asked for that sign. Because if I had gotten a big coincidence at that time, something had happened that felt like a response to my request, I would have assumed that that meant that the God that I had been taught about growing up, that God was behind it, that version of Christianity was correct and real. And I needed to get away from that. I needed to sort of find my footing, find my intellectual objectivity and maybe emotional objectivity from the subject too, by going through the process of losing all of those beliefs and having to give them up. And once that happened, and once I got to the point where, I learned enough to sort of see the world from many different perspectives and learn even more about other world religions, other people's ways of conceptualizing divinity, then I was able to have these strong coincidental experiences without immediately assuming that I knew what they meant or who they were coming from, without all of the religious baggage coming along with them. So I do think I needed that time to not have any signs, not have any of that interference, and just kind of break down some of the beliefs that I had grown up with. And only once that was done could I safely get the answer that I had asked for back then.
Well, thank you very much for your time. I deeply appreciate it, and this was a fantastic conversation. So thank you.
Thank you so much, James. Yeah, it's really been a pleasure.